Welcome back, everyone. This is week 9 of the Liberation Music Therapy series. This is presentation 9, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So we've been working our way through the praxis wheel, and we got to the 6th spoke, which was educational practice and transformational practice. It was really important to break it up into 3 sections just because there was a lot of material to cover. We're still covering a lot of material today. These last 3 sessions have been particularly information heavy just because it is straight up data and frameworks. Today's session into 2 parts, and that is part 1, socialism, and part 2, pedagogy of the oppressed. I'm adding 1 extra session after this, all about music, just because we haven't actually talked about music, and it was just one of those things when coming to the end of the writing of everything, it made sense to me, at least, to have something that's completely dedicated to just the practice of music in this work. Part 1, socialism. Now, we spoke about 2 sessions ago a concept on how to conceptualize the social forces of which really came out of the 20th century and probably the largest social forces that we are contesting with or working through right now. And this is not an exact science. This is not a precise measurement. This is simply a framework to help us navigate as we move through these various spaces. And we first covered reactionary chauvinism, which is a political orientation that describes a reversal of social change or a restoration or preservation of hierarchical social orders. That's the reactionary element, with a chauvinistic worldview, which is an ideology of aggressive superiority, asserting that a particular group is inherently better and therefore entitled to dominance. And then the following week we got into neoliberal capitalism, which is one of the stages of capitalism. Some debate on if we're in the late stage of capitalism or in the neoliberal stage of capitalism. Again, these are not precise sciences. These are simply categories to help understand how to frame the world as we're seeing it. But we spoke about how neoliberalism is a political economic doctrine that seeks to extend market logic in all areas of life through competition and privatization, deregulation, free trade, reduced social welfare, and a strong protection of capital, even if it is through state power. And then capitalism, which is complete orientation around capital as being the profit motive, being the complete orientation on how we navigate trade and navigate wealth, economics, and finances. We spoke about how capitalism is, in this framework, the root of colonialism, which through the imperial boomerang ends up creating the conditions that allows fascism to arise. So for today, we're going to be going to the 3rd part of the 3-way fight, which is on revolutionary socialism, or we might also say just autonomous groups or autonomous social movements. And this can include indigenous movements, this can include activist movements, but really anything that is oriented towards a revolutionary state of being. So revolutionary describes a strategy or orientation that seeks to fundamentally, structurally change society as opposed to reforming the existing system. And then socialism is the economic system in which the workers own the means of production. So it's a political movement that seeks systemic transformation beyond capitalism, aiming to abolish class exploitation and reorganize society around collective ownership, democratic control, and social equity. It emerges from mass struggle rather than elite reforms. We're going to get into the big specifics. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how socialism itself is an economic and political philosophy that advocates for the social ownership of the means of production rather than private ownership. And it's really been expressed through four major political tendencies or major political families. And the way we can think about this is socialism, that is the collective ownership of the means of production, so that work serves social needs rather than private profit. Another tendency within the socialist movement is anarchism, and this is the rejection of all imposed hierarchies. So society is organized through voluntary cooperation and without rulers or without states. There's another tendency, which we would call communism, and this is a classless, stateless society with common ownership, where production is organized for human need as opposed to profit. And finally, we get to social democracy, and this is capitalism with very strong regulations, strong welfare systems, and strong labor protections to reduce inequality without abolishing private ownership. These are the four major schools of thought or major tendencies within the larger movement. I am not going to advocate for anyone above or below. I think they all have value, and I think they all have criticisms that are worthwhile to explore. I think that these are tools. These are all tools for mechanisms on trying to make life better for those around us. So let's talk about the actual organization and power structures of different forms of socialism. The first thing to really orient around is the differentiation between utopian socialism versus scientific socialism. Utopian socialism, it's described as a presentation of visions and outlines for an imaginary or futuristic ideal or a socialistic society that pursues ideals of positive interpersonal relationships that is separate from the capitalist mechanisms. However, later socialists, most notably the anarchists and the Marxists, as well as conservative critics of socialism, have disparaged utopian socialism as not being grounded in the actual material conditions of existing societies. So it is a differing vision than a revolutionary socialism or a social democratic movement. Scientific socialism, this is the application of a historical materialist analysis to the development of socialism as not just a practical and achievable outcome of historical processes, but the only possible outcome that we should be working towards. The biggest difference between scientific socialism and utopian socialism is the basing itself upon material conditions as opposed to ideological spaces. The final causes of social changes are not what happens in our brains, but what actually happens in the material world. So we're really going to be utilizing a scientific socialist framework for today. We're talking about practical and data-based and material-oriented ways of understanding the world. The two major schools of thought is reformist socialism versus revolutionary socialism. Now, I'm going to tell you all right up front that I think both forms are practical for many, many different reasons. And we're going to get into that. Reformism, it's a political tendency that advocates for the reform of an existing system or an existing institution. And it doesn't outright abolish things, and it doesn't advocate for revolutionary change. And so if we think within the socialist movement, reformism is a view that gradual changes through existing institutions eventually lead to a fundamental change in society's political systems, our economic systems, and our social systems. It is a tendency that grew out of revolutionary socialism, looking for more quote-unquote practical or more peaceful means to gain equity or equitable practices. The criticism of it is that it is not asking for a total overhaul of the systemic issues in which we face. I'll put a piece of nuance right after getting into revolutionary socialism, but revolutionary socialism is a philosophical view or a political orientation within the socialist movement that stresses the idea that an actual revolution is necessary to bring that structural change. And it needs to be pointed out that revolution does not have to be violent. It is simply a restructuring of the past systems. So if we think of reform as working within the system and revolution as working outside or against the system, those are the two kind of ways to think about it. Now, though I orient my practice in a revolutionary framework, meaning that I'm trying to create new ideas or restructure things that already exist and trying to actually get out of them entirely, we have to understand that there is a very serious use of both worlds. And the example I give people is, I may be a prison abolitionist. I may be revolutionary in my political views. But there is no way I would ever stand in the way of an activist group trying to put serious restrictions on solitary confinement. So even though my goal in my own activism, my own orientation is to remove prisons entirely, I'm not going to stop reformist work from happening while it is taking place. And in fact, sometimes the reformists have a better understanding of the larger picture than the revolutionaries. And so these are things to take into account. And so I'm not here to moralize between the two frameworks. I am just here to present that there are different ways of achieving the concepts of equity and collective ownership of the means of production. There's a couple of broad orientations of power or broad logics of governance. The way we can think about it is socialism from above, socialism from below, or democratic socialism. So those are kind of the three large orientations. Now, I am oversimplifying many, many, many tendencies. I'm already hearing all the Marxists from all the various tendencies popping up with their little pieces of insight and critique. And I'm telling you that, yes, I know it is much more complicated than this. This is for general practice on how to identify what you are seeing in real time, or at least understand the material you may be reading or witnessing or working through. So socialism from above is change driven by either a state apparatus or a party apparatus or a professional leadership on behalf of the people. So this would be, just to put it in a non-moralistic way, a proponent of a form of socialism from above would be somebody like Rosa Luxemburg, who, though she is quite literally a socialist from below in her behavior, the fact that she is oriented around any kind of structure from above would put her in at least a certain class of socialism from above, because she is a professional oriented in developing revolutionary work or developing work towards change. So that's kind of how I orient what we mean by from above versus from below. It does not change that there have been serious crimes done in socialist systems, especially with socialism from above. We also have to recognize that we are interpreting it through a capitalist neoliberal framing. We were raised in that system. That is the system our media is built around. So we just need to be very critical with how we analyze these systems. Socialism from below, this is more change driven from mass participation, grassroots organizing, labor organizing, workplace, community organizing, community power. You might think of the Black Panthers. You might think of the Zora Mandani campaign was done in a socialism from below. it's oriented around grassroots change as opposed to professionalization of understanding theory or understanding praxis. And then there's democratic socialism, which is it's a way to combine elections, labor work, and community organizing. And the concept behind it is to democratize the economy and the state. So those are three different orientations of how the structure of a socialist system may work, as well as two different strategies of which you might work within a scientific socialist framework. We're going to get into some of the notable schools of thought, and we're not going to get into many of the specifics. I'm going to give a very brief concept of what these notable schools of thought have offered the socialist movement. The first is Marxism, and this is the foundational school of thought that was put forward by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, speaking about class struggle. Then we get to Leninism, and this is the theoretical orientation that really came out of the work of Vladimir Lenin and a real practical way of applying Marxism, applying that class analysis to an organizational structure. And so the three areas that I would say Lenin contributed to the socialist movement is anti-imperialism. He really helped categorize the concept of capital's endless need for growth requires an imperialist practice to gain that growth, to give space for that growth to take place. Understanding that that is how capital operates, having an anti-imperialist framework really came out of Lenin. Vanguardism. Now, I've got complicated views on vanguardism. I think there have been a lot of problems with things that have come out of vanguardism. But the biggest piece of it is its organized political leadership. And I don't think there's any issue with having people organize professionally together to understand different skills and different perspectives. Do I agree with all the rigidness that came out of this, which is democratic centralism? Absolutely not. Now, democratic centralism is a very interesting idea that came out of Leninism. The short version is once the party has reached 60% agreement, there cannot be a shift from the party line. And this has some very good benefits in regards to organizing revolutionary struggle, but there are many problems that come from it as well, most notably authoritarianism and totalitarianism, which was really emphasized during the Stalin era of the USSR. Then there's Marxist-Leninism, which this is really the combo of a one-party state with a planned Marxian economy. And this is probably the most prominent whenever you hear the word communism. Communism never works. They're talking about Marxist-Leninism. Marxist-Leninism is complicated. I think that Marxist-Leninism is extremely problematic when it is in power of a state. I think there are a lot of issues with the structure of it. However, there is a piece that we need to be mindful of when we are speaking about Marxist-Leninism, and that is that there is an extremely pro-colonial anti-Marxist-Leninist worldview. It is very common in the West for leftists to be anti-Marxist-Leninism based solely on the propaganda of which we have been raised in. The thing that is extremely important to understand about Marxist-Leninism is it is a successful revolutionary strategy that can be studied. All of these revolutions that actually came to be, the majority of them came through this school of thought, and so that needs to be taken into account. It's extremely classist when we in the global north look at the global south and moralize on the way in which they are organizing out of struggle. So it's nuanced. It's a nuanced take. And I will work with any Marxist-Leninist. I don't agree with all of their stuff, but I will work with any one of them. There's Trotskyism, and the big piece that Trotsky really added to the socialist movement is the concept of permanent revolution, which is permanently applying revolutionary change to systems and structures, as well as a general opposition to the concept of socialism in one country, which is the concept that Joseph Stalin applied to the USSR, and I'm oversimplifying this, but applied that methodology to the USSR after Lenin's death. And then we get into Maoism, or Mao Zedong thought, or Maoist thought, as you might hear it called. But the three big contributions are the concept of contradiction, which is a primary and a secondary contradiction. The concept of a mass line, which is you learn from the people to give to the people. As well as the concept of a united front, which really influenced the Black Panther Party, really influenced the Rainbow Coalition that came from a lot of Mao's writing. So then we get into anarchism, and anarchism is oriented around complete anti-authoritarianism, complete rejection of the state and rejection of hierarchical power. So that is one major contribution that anarchism has given to the socialist movement. But I would say probably the most important piece of organizing that the anarchist school of thought has really helped us understand would be direct action, or engaging in things directly. The second comes from the anarcho-communism school of thought, which is mutual aid, or collective ownership based on need. Another school of thought within anarchism is anarcho-syndicalism, and this is really about revolutionary trade unionism. You can think of the Industrial Workers of the World, who I have right here on my wall. They're a very well-known industrial trade union. Anarcho-syndicalism has a lot of literature and writing on how to organize direct democracy, as well as the concept of the general strike as a means of transformation. There's also social ecology, which came from Murray Bookchin, and this was really linking the crisis of the ecological crisis to hierarchy and the ways of which humans attempt to dominate nature. I thought it was important to put some indigenous movements as well. We're not really going to be covering these, but I think that they just need to be identified and pointed out. There's Neo-Zapatismo, which is the movement from the Zapatistas down in Chiapas, Mexico. There's a lot of complicated stuff that's been going on there since 2023, which we're not going to cover in this, but look up Neo-Zapatismo to learn more about that. There's also Democratic Confederalism, which is the organizing structure of Rojava, an autonomous region in northern Syria that is being run on anarchist feminist principles amongst the Kurdish people there. There's also Ujamaa, and Ujamaa is a form of socialism or cooperative economics that came out of Tanzania. It's an African form of socialism that was put into applied logic and applied knowledge. And then there's Third Worldism, which is a term we don't use now, but it's a concept on orienting those from the third world or those from the global south as the foundation of building a socialist movement. I thought these four were very important to include just for your own research as you dive deeper into these various movements. And then there are the actual liberation movements that have been on the ground. The feminist movements, the queer liberation movements, the black liberation movements, the indigenous liberation movements, or the what we might call land back movement, labor and anti-capitalist popular movements, disability justice, are all influenced by these socialist frameworks. Any trade union is under a socialist framework. So these are just some schools of thought that I think are all worthwhile learning about, critiquing, and taking from. So I have a synthesis here of the terms that I think are the most helpful. They've at least helped me in my practice, and I think that they can help you as well. But if we synthesize some of these terms, from Marxism, the first term we're going to take is class struggle, which is the ongoing conflict between social classes. And this is driven by the unequal and competing interests over resources, over labor, and who gets to decide how society is organized. So you can see this in how it shows up to break up strikes, in how it shows up to incarcerate people of color, or poor people, or queer people. You can see it in the propaganda that is put out by various entities or by lobbying to put various coercion or deprivations, sometimes outright violence. But class struggle is the foundation of what we are working with. Dialectical materialism is a way of understanding the world that starts with material conditions. So understand that how people live, how they work, and how they relate. And this argues that the change happens through contradictions or opposing forces. There is a dialectic within a system that drives conflict, development, oppression, and transformation. Instead of treating ideas as the main engine of history, dialectical materialism treats ideas as shaped by social reality and uses dialectical analysis to figure out what conflicts are really at the root of a problem and what kinds of actions could actually resolve it. So when we start to think of things as dialectical, it's a constant conversation. That is what we mean when we say dialectical materialism. So historical materialism is a way of explaining history that says that societies change mainly because of how people produce and how people reproduce, whether that be life, labor, technology, and the various economic relationships that organize these productions. So as those material conditions shift, there is reshapings of politics, there's reshapings of culture, of ideas, and that is what generates class conflict. And that can be the drive of these major social transformations. So if we think of dialectical materialism as the philosophy of Marxism, we can think of historical materialism as the science of Marxism. Another term is contradiction itself. And so this is a contradiction is a dynamic relationship in which opposing forces, tendencies, or elements coexist within the same system. And this drives its movement, its development, and its transformation. So just being aware that there is a contradiction out there. A contradiction is simply something that is opposite or opposing you. The fact that capitalism exists and that requires human labor means that there is going to be a contradiction of the person's labor and the sense of exploitation. The final piece from Marxism that I find very important is the concept of hegemony or cultural hegemony. And this is when a ruling group maintains power not simply through force, but by shaping the quote-unquote common sense ideas, values, or norms so the worldview feels natural, it feels inevitable, and it feels good for everybody. So the argument is that liberation requires building a counter-hegemony, organizing culture, education, and everyday meaning-making so people can recognize domination and act collectively to change it. I have found that Marxism has some of the best analytical tools. Where Marxism fails is an ethical framework to help keep us on task if we deviate. At the center of anarchism is a critique of hierarchy. The critique of hierarchy examines how unequal power relationships become normalized, enforced, and reproduced, especially when authority is detached from collective consent or accountability. This is very important to just have in mind when you're working. It's good to understand the world in a dialectical way. It's good to understand history in a materialist way. It is good to recognize contradictions as a social force. Revolutionary socialism has a contradiction of neoliberal capitalism and a contradiction of reactionary chauvinism. Hegemony is how we are actually indoctrinated into the system. So the critique of hierarchy allows being able to remember that we are trying to make things as even as possible, or as horizontal as possible. Horizontal in its decision making. Not equal, for any weirdo libertarian who might be watching this, not literally equal in ability and skill, but equal in treatment and fairness. Direct action, the practice of people acting collectively to meet their needs or confront injustice without relying on intermediaries such as state or formal authorities. That is like this group, this very workshop. This is an act of direct action. Mutual aid is a form of collective care and cooperation in which people support one another to survive and thrive. It's a way to recognize interdependence as a source of strength, as opposed to trying to find what we would call charity. So if we think of Marxism as a solid way to apply class analysis, and anarchism as a solid way to critique hierarchy while we are doing that class analysis, three other terms just to keep in mind: false consciousness, reification, and praxis. So false consciousness refers to a condition in which people internalize beliefs that obscure or justify systems of domination, preventing recognition of their own oppression or collective interests. So an example I like to give is 2010. Elton John, when asked about what his views were on gay marriage, and he said, "I have no problem with two men getting a civil union and forming a relationship together, but marriage is a religious institution and should be done through religious organizations." Blah, 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 blah. Fast forward, and after gay marriage was legalized in the United States, Elton John had a response of, "Why was I against gay marriage? He literally married his partner of many, many, many years." And so that's an example that I like to use of false consciousness, where you can just have a belief that makes no sense for your betterment or for your well-being, but it is just simply because we have been conditioned into that way of thinking. Reification is the process which social relationships, power structures, and human-created systems are treated as natural, as fixed or thing-like, rather than historically produced and changeable. For instance, men are not naturally more aggressive. We have attributes within our being that may influence aggressiveness, but we are much more transformed into aggressive beings due to social structures. Men don't cry. That is an example of reification. Women are more emotional than men. It's not true. It's not true. Then we get into praxis, and this is the ongoing cycle of reflection and action through which theory is tested, refined, and transformed into lived practice toward social changes. And that gets us to part 2, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. All right, so I'm going to read just a quote from the founder of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire. "Pedagogy of the oppressed is a pedagogy which must be forged with, not for, the oppressed, whether individuals or peoples, in the incessant struggle to regain their humanity." A way to visualize what a dialectical relationship looks like we first have our social force at the beginning. And through an action comes into contact with the social force B. That creates a contradiction. And due to this, there is a reaction from the second social force. And so when we're talking about the dialectical relationship, we're not just simply talking about social force A or social force B, but we're also talking about what happens in that reaction, which is the third force. And this is where we talk about resistance or cultural hegemony, any kind of response. It is what we actually do with the conditions that are put forward. So, just to shape it out, we've got the oppressors, and they are the historically privileged group. We'll call this white people in the United States. White people, as an institution, applied dehumanization, the actions of dehumanization, of underestimation, of prescription, of exclusion and negation upon an oppressed group, a historically underprivileged social group. And so we will call this group black people. So the oppressor, the white people, through dehumanization, through exclusion, applies pressure to a group, creating an oppressed structure. So what happens in a liberation structure is we have the oppressor through dehumanization, and we have the oppressed who can choose, when we know how to do this, when we become aware, can choose through human processing to find ways of rehumanization, organization, critique, or criticizing basic structures or basic common norms, having a worldview of resistance, and eventually leading to liberation. Some key concepts that come out of this dialectical process when we are talking about pedagogy of the oppressed. The first is that it's a critique of what Freire calls the banking model of education. And Freire argues that traditional education is where a teacher deposits knowledge into passive students. So it's viewing this as a tool of oppression that maintains the status quo. What Freire proposes is a problem-posing education. And this is proposing an alternative where education is dialogue-based. It is about shared investigation where both the teacher and the student are learning together, developing a critical awareness of their shared world, not the teacher's world and the student's world, but the community's world. We think about that through the process of dialogue and praxis, which is education should be a dialogical process, which leads us to a space where we can reflect upon what we have learned and use that reflection towards action upon the world as a way to transform it. Now, we're talking very high-minded. You're never having these dialogues with the folks you're working with. This is just a start to conceptualize a way in which you can move through spaces that is going to be oriented around people as opposed to the powerful. The goal of all of this is conscientization, critical consciousness. This is the goal for the oppressed, to develop a critical awareness of their situation and their power to transform it. So it is that we are not just objects, but we are subjects of our own history. It is the ultimate aim for the oppressed to become beings for themselves, not things to be used. It's about humanization. So what exactly is the banking model? The banking model of education describes a teacher-centered approach in which knowledge is treated as a commodity. So the educator deposits information into the passive learner, who is expected to receive and store it. Freire argues that this model suppresses critical thinking, it denies learners lived knowledge, and it reproduces domination by positioning students as objects rather than active, creative co-producers of understanding and of learning. Prime example is in the Malcolm X autobiography, when Malcolm is speaking to his teacher and states how he would like to be a lawyer, and his teacher responds with, "You can't do that. That's just not realistic for you." That is the banking model of education, prescribing who they are, and that is just who you are. So the problem posing is a dialogical approach where teachers and learners collaborate on investigating real social conditions through questioning, reflection, and action. This is a long process. So rather than depositing information, we're treating knowledge as something that's co-created in relationship, that we're cultivating together, and we're developing collective agency to actually transform these realities. So a really good way that I saw in real time, there's an organization called HALA. They stands for How Our Lives Link All Together. They're an organization that formed a mental health nonprofit while they were all locked up together. I forget which prison they were locked up at, but a lot of the guys are out now. One of the things that they came to working with in their community was, instead of saying things like "fuck you" or "suck my dick," they literally changed their language on the way they communicated. If I feel like I need to say "fuck you," I'm going to say "thank you." Yo, thank you. So they would do these little things like that. Blah, 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 blah. Every single person, at least of the original founders, is now outside of the prison. Corey Green, it's his organization, has a PhD in psychology that he got from NYU. There was no mental health therapist who came in and healed these guys. It was through collective engagement that these folks started to, okay, we're seeing this problem. How can we work on this together? It takes time. One problem a lot of facilitators have is they think problem posing is a way for learner to be able to understand a situation quickly. That's not the case. We are bit by bit getting people to help awaken their internal being they already have. There's actually a process for dialogical actions. These are unity, compassion, organization, and cultural synthesis. I try to, when I meet a group of people, orient my position on what I'm doing in the space. It's important to be compassionate. We've talked about all of this already in the praxis wheel. And cultural synthesis is, how do you start to actually integrate these pieces of culture that you're learning without appropriating and without invading? So the anti-dialogical actions: conquest, manipulation, divide and rule, cultural invasion. So our goal through these 4 dialogical actions on building unity, building compassion, building organization, building a cultural synthesis is really to try to build what we call consciousness raising. So it's a collective learning practice in which people share lived experience to recognize that personal struggles are shaped by larger social, political, economic systems. This comes from the feminist movement in the 1960s, but it was applied to pedagogy of the oppressed. Instead of thinking of your situation as, this is my private problem, it turns into, this is a shared structural condition. How often have I brought up sexual abuse in this course, in this workshop? It is because the majority of people who I work with, no matter the space, when they're dealing with some deep-seated trauma, it is due to some kind of childhood sexual abuse. So, it is important to understand that if you have experienced abuse, there is an entire structural condition that many people share. So that's what the point of this is. It's about starting with lived experience, not abstract theory. So starting an actual dialogue and reflection, starting on seeing how the system actually harms the individual first. How is the system fucking with you? How are they fucking with you? Not how are they fucking with that person. How are they fucking with you? That's how I think about it. You can work through those bigotries. You can work through those issues that may pop up. But it's about consciousness raising. It is amazing how often somebody will say, have all these homophobic views, but then you organize with a person who's locked up, who's LGBTQ, or you have somebody on the staff who's LGBTQ, who's really well liked, and all of a sudden these homophobic folks keep their mouths shut when all the bigoted things they want to say start to pop up when such and such person's around. And it's just little bit. Did we cure this person's homophobia? Absolutely not. I do not think so. But it's about that slowly, bit by bit, consciousness raising. Praxis, reflection plus action, it's a continuous loop oriented toward real world change rather than abstract understanding. And you can think of it as in a praxis cycle. Do, think, change. Or maybe in 5 steps. You have the actual act, the intervention on what you're actually doing, the actual behavior, the actual practice, the actual experiment that you're doing. This is an act right now for me. Doing this workshop is an act for me in the praxis. I have been observing this act. What happened? Who's it benefiting? Who's not benefiting? That's why I'm adding the music one, because it was like, on observation, realized we're not really covering music in this course on liberation music therapy. We get to reflect what assumptions were revealed, what power dynamics showed up. Y'all, I find out power dynamics all the time. All the time. Can't believe I said this thing. Can't believe I did this thing. It's important to do your act, observe your act, reflect on that, and reframe. Update your understanding. Discard what didn't work and what doesn't serve. And then you act again. You re-enter the world with a refined approach. And we say repeat, so praxis is iterative, not linear. And if you'll notice, I put the Fibonacci spiral here, meaning I don't think of things as cyclical, meaning that, like, I don't think of history as repeating itself. I think of it as history is moving through a spiral. So we're moving forward. And there are similar repetitions, but it is not identical. It is similar. So that is why, for instance, you can study a historical genocide and understand what a genocide looks like when one is actually happening if you know what a genocide looks like in other contexts. They may not be all the same, but you're going to notice things. A couple of visuals just to help reframe or put this into perspective. We've got our banking model of education, and we've got the educator. They're the owner of the knowledge. And we have the student who does not own the knowledge. So in the banking model, it is a one-way dialogue. The educator is speaking to the student. Student is not speaking to the educator. There's no engagement. So the way that the cycle works in the banking model is the educator deposits knowledge. They discipline the student if the knowledge is not received. That can be through bad grades. That can be through failing a class. That can be through any number of disciplinary acts. And this informs a person's reality. Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims and the Indians all got together to share in a 3-day meal. And everyone got along. When the student accepts this, they are supposed to project to the teacher that they've received the knowledge, that they are memorizing the facts, and that they have accepted reality for what it is. Now, this does get a little weird. Like, I'm a skeptic in a lot of my ways. I'm pretty scientific in the way I view the world, the way I analyze things. So when I talk to certain types of conspiracy theorists, it can be a bit challenging. But I've found that it is actually much healthier to step back and let a conspiracy theorist conspire, think of their things, and let their mind wander. Instead of telling them they're wrong, guide them. Give some insights, pieces of awareness. Instead of the banking model of education, let's look at the problem-posing model. So in here, you've got the educator-learner. So instead of simply an educator, you are a learner who is the educator. You are coming with all the scientific knowledge. You've studied the craft. You've studied the art form. You've studied the skill. You've studied the information. You are an expert in a field. You are somebody who knows more about something than another person. So you are the educator in that role. You know more about washing dishes. You whatever circumstance in which you know more, you are the educator. But you are also learning through problem posing and dialogue and reflective action. So it is so important to not only engage with questions, but also engage in dialogue and show through your actions that you are serious. The student learner, they are bringing to the table the experiential knowledge. They are going to have insights that the educator learner just does not have. And when you open this dialogue up, it can expand into healthy problem posing, dialoguing, and reflective action. We can think of the colonizers, the quote-unquote superior culture, the developed culture. And through the actions of violence, they are able to conquer. And through conquering, they put forward an authoritarian agenda to impose a worldview and impose values onto the colonized or the quote-unquote inferior or underdeveloped culture, in which that culture responds with being terrorized, being controlled, following and obeying, mimicking hegemony. Look at 2024, the amount of Black and Hispanic voters who supported Donald Trump. That to me was a prime example of cultural hegemony. Because literally, there were Latin voters who cast their vote for Donald Trump in November. By February, were being deported by ICE. So this happens all over the place. There were Tutsis that worked with Hutu extremists. There were Jewish collaborators during the Nazi Holocaust and extermination of Jewish people in Germany. This is not an abnormal thing. Anytime somebody brings forward a such and such fill in the blank woman, person of color, LGBTQ person who is coming out with all these reactionary, chauvinistic views, realize that they are simply mimicking cultural hegemony. A cultural synthesis approach. You have your leaders, your revolutionary leaders. Engagement is participatory. They are committed to the cause. They are responsible with their leadership. Y'all, if you are a facilitator, you have responsibility over people. Even if you don't think you signed up for it, if you are facilitating, you've got power. Through cooperating, you are learning. I learn from my participants probably more than they learn from me, to be very honest. I may come off as any kind of learned, and that is only because I have learned how to listen deeply to so many people. So there should be investigating, planning, actually thinking things through, and sharing this knowledge or this wisdom. And we have the people who, in a healthy environment, are actually engaged, actually developing consciousness, willing to work together. And again, it's the same, it's about the cycle. Cooperating, learning, investigating, planning, sharing. If you expect a group to do this by session 2, You will be very disappointed at the results. This is all about titration. This is all about bit by bit. The point is that instead of thinking of ourselves as the owner of the knowledge, we are a participant in the knowledge. Another reminder: beware the fascist impulse. This is an expression from the three-way fight perspective that underscores the importance of maintaining vigilance and caution against tendencies or inclinations that align with fascist ideologies. It serves as a critical reminder that elements of fascist thinkings and behavior can surface in any context, even socialist context, urging activists to remain alert to such proclivities to stave off the ascent of authoritarian and oppressive ideologies. So remember, colonialism, which is an expression of capitalist imperialism, colonialism is exported fascism, and fascism is imported colonialism. And with that, we are done with the education piece of the praxis wheel. Next week, we're going to be opening up into the seventh spoke, which is accountability and collective agency. The following week, we'll be doing liberatory truth and understanding justice. These are both a little less theoretical, a little less information as the last 3 weeks have been, but I just found the three-way fight to be an extremely useful way of framing the world in the work that we're doing or learning how to do in this space. It just felt important to at least give somewhat of a deep dive into each piece of the three-way fight, which is neoliberal capitalism, reactionary chauvinism, and revolutionary socialism. And so with that, again, I'm going to leave this up. This is for free, forever, for always. I don't want money for this. I don't expect money for this. I don't need money for this. That being said, I do put a lot of time into this. I've been putting a lot of time into this, and it is helpful. So yeah, if you feel the ability or the need to donate, you can. Either Venmo, Zelle, PayPal, or Cash App. Stay connected. You can check out my projects, performances, and resources at dorianwallace.com, as well as any of my essays, workshops, or anything on liberation music or liberation music therapy reflections at my Substack, which is dorianwallace.substack.com. And with that, we'll catch you all next time. Peace.